We're now on Daf Yudam and Beis, and we're explaining Rabbi Yeshua why Rabbi Yeshua insists that you cannot derive the conclusion of Shalol Lishma Apostles of Karban and apply that principle to Asham based on a combination of Karban Chatos and Karban Pesach, because Chazrani Chalila. You're going to keep going around in circles, because every time you want to pick up a Malamed, let's say you want to derive it from Chatos, we're going to say that there the dam is Nizrak Lemala. And if you want to derive from Pesach, we're going to say with Pesach has Mano Kavua. And right now, the Gemara is not accepting, according to Rabbi Yeshua, a Tzad Shavah. Chazer Rabbi Eliezer v'Don din acher. So at this point, Rabbi Eliezer backs off, and he introduces a whole nother approach as to how we derive that in Karban Asham, there's a psul of Shalol Lishma, the apostles of Karban. Chatas never bought who? B'shchita. Now, again, it may say who, but it's really he, because the Karban Chatas is in the feminine. He Lishma Kshera, right? He means for the sake of a Chatas, then the Karban is kosher, implying that Shalol Lishma Psula. Pesach Nami never bought who. Again, we have the word who, B'zvicha and Shchita, who lishmo kosher, shelo lishmo posel. And says Rabbi Eliezer, well, guess what? Af Asham nemer bo who lishmo kosher, shelo lishmo posel. We should apply the same yardstick and the same derivation from the word who as it's found in Karban Asham. Omelo Rabbi Yeshua, chatos nemer bo who b'shchita. It all depends, says Rabbi Yeshua, where you find the word who. If the word who applies in shchita, it's telling you that the shchita has to be lishma, then it's ksher shalol lishma psula. In Pesach also, the word who says it in zvicha, in the shchita itself, right? For example, in Vayikra Perek Dalet it says v'shocher oso b'mokom asher yishchar es ha'ol l'fnei Hashem chatas hu, and in Korban Pesach it says v'amartem zevach Pesach hu. But, and who kosher lishmo, so aval asham. But let's see where the word who appears in the parsha of Asham. And the answer is that if we take a look in Vayikra Perek Zayin, it says v'hiktir osama kohen hamizbecha ishel Hashem Asham hu. And this is referring to the Aktaras Imurim. There's certain parts of the animal that have to be burnt on the Mizbeach, but that's way after the Zrika. Lo nemer bo hu el yachar aktoras emurim, v'hu atzma shelo iktiru emurim kosher. Even if he has a machshava of shalol lishma at the time of aktoras emurim, it doesn't pass the carbon. The carbon was already clinched and completed at the time of the Zrika. So therefore, even though you found the word who in the parsha of Asham, it cannot be telling me and being mechadish and established for me a psul of shalol lishma, because even if he had a shalol lishma at the time of Aktaras Emurim, it would not pass the carbon. Amalo Rabbi Eliezer. So now Rabbi Eliezer again has to backtrack and come up with another source to derive the psul of shalol lishma in Karban Asham. Hare Omer, the Torah says, kachatos ka Asham. The Torah clearly has a hekesh between Chatos and Asham in Vayikra Perek Zayin, and it's coming to teach me ma Chatos shalol lishma posel af Asham shalol lishma posel. We have now a hekesh between Chatos and Asham. And by the way, Rashi points out that hekesh is a very powerful derivation because you don't have a pircha on a hekesh. Omar Mar. Now we go back to the Brisa. Amar Rav Yeshua Chazrani Chalila. Frek the Gemara Meheder Dina V'Leise B'Metzad. Even though Rabbi Yeshua has proven that there's a chumrah in Chatos and there's a special chumrah in Pesach, but nevertheless, why can't he admit that it should be a tzad shaveh? Mishum de'kol mifrach, because there's a common chumrah that applies to both Chatos and Pesach, that doesn't apply to Karban Asham. So what do we mean by tzad kares? In the case of chatos, the machayev of chatos is that he violated an avera sheyesh ba kares. In the case of carbon pesach, it's the only essay besides a milah which generates a chiyuv kares. So therefore, we have a chumrah to both carbon chatos and carbon pesach, and we cannot derive any conclusions about shalol lishma apostle to other karbanos, namely to carbon asham, from these two that both have a common chumrah. Now, Tosfos here has a problem because a carbon asham is also brought on a safek kares, right? He doesn't know whether he ate chelev or whether he ate shuman. And on the side that he ate shuman, he be chayiv kares. But Tosfos says the kapara of asham is not really kapara on kares. It's only a stayover, meaning until he finds out whether he ate, whether indeed he ate chelev. During that period of time, the carbon asham was meant to protect him from punishment, but it's not a real bona fide, full-fledged kapara. Amalo Rabbi Yeshua. I'm sorry. Where are we up to? Yeah, that's where we're up to. Amar Rabbi Yeshua lo. So let's go back to the rejection of Rabbi Yeshua to the derivation from chatos. Lo im amarta b'chatos shekain dama lemalo. Right, we said that there's a chumrah in chatos that the zrikas adam has to be on the top half of the mizbeach, whereas asham is lamato. So the Gemara now says, wait a minute, that's a very nice argument, but if Rabbi Yeshua wanted to demonstrate the chumrah of chatos, he didn't have to stretch his arm out to the din of zrika lamal. Many dinim that are unique to chatos. For example, lemalei lo amat b'chatos shekei nichnas dama lifnai v'lifnim. Right, we have the case of a chatos hapnimis, which is the only carbon where the zrikas adam is done inside the heichal. So the Gemara says Rabbi Yeshua would not want to use that as a proof that a chatos is l'chumra because bechatos chitzonos kamrinu. You could always come back and say, well, let's derive shalol lishma apostles and carbon from a chatos chitzona, a classic chatos where the dam is nizrak on the mizbach on the mizbech ha chitzoni. Gemara says, but she'im nichnas dam lifnai v'lifnim psula. What's unique about chatos? If the dam of the chatos was brought inside the heichal, it passes the carbon. And that's based on a pasuk in Vayikra Perek Vav, Kol Chatos Asher Yuva Doma El Oel Moed L'Chapra Kodesh Lo Seochel. And we derive from here that if a Kohen takes the blood of a classic Chatos Chitzona and he brings it into the Heichal, the carbon is pasul. There's no such psul in carbon asham. So the Gemara answers, Islay Rabbi Eliezer Afa Asham. Rabbi Eliezer, who establishes an equation between carbon asham and carbon chatos, would say that if the dam of the carbon asham, like that of a chatos, was brought inside the heichel, it indeed passes the carbon. But why didn't Rabbi Yeshua avail himself of another argument? Shekei mechaperes al chayve krisos. That a carbon chatos is unique and is l'chumra because it's mechaper on a chiyuv kares. And once again, we come back to what we said before, that in the case of a carbon asham, it only protects him on a temporary basis, like a shield before the punish to protect against punishment. So the Gemara says, but wait a minute, chatos is not by definition a kapara for a chiyuv kares, because chatos is shmias hakol. Right? If let's say a person had edus, testimony to give to his friend, and he denied under oath that he had the testimony, and he really did have testimony, in that case he brings a carbon chatos, and non-testimony is not a chiyuv kares. So therefore Rabbi Eliezer still has a right to derive by equation Osham from Chatos because the case of Chatos of Shmias Kol, where there is no Kares. So Gemara asks, but wait a minute. Shekain to Unarba Matanos, if Rabbi Yeshua is searching for a Chumra and Chatos over Osham, why isn't he invoke the fact that a Chatos requires 4 Matanos? You have to be Zorik the Dam on all 4 corners of the Mizbeach, which doesn't apply to the case of an Osham, which only requires Shtayim. Right? You do a Zrika on 2 corners of the Mizbeach diagonally, one from the other. And the Gemara says, you know why Rabbi Yeshua didn't invoke the halach of Arba Matanos in Chatos is because Rabbi Shmuel, he's worried about the sheet of Rabbi Shmuel, the Yomi Kol Adon Tunim Arba Matanos. Rabbi Shmuel holds straight across the board. Every carbon requires Matanos on all 4 corners. Gemara says, but wait a minute. Why doesn't Rabbi Yeshua invoke the halacha of Tu'unal Arba Kronos? No, it's not enough in the case of Chatos to do the Zrika on the 4 sides. You have to do it on the Keren of the Mizbeach, right? A Keren that's shot up on each one of the 4 corners, and that requires a Matana on the Kronos. So in the cases of, for example, Ola and Osham, even though Rabbi Shmuel always requires 4 Matanos on all Karbonos, but he doesn't require that it be applied to the corners, the Kronos of the altar. So the Gemara says, L'tamech, if you're arguing from Kronos, and you're saying that Rabbi Yeshua should have considered the Kronos as a Chumrah, I'm going to add to you another 3 Chumras. Ika Etzba. In the case of all Karbonos, he takes the Kli that has the Dam, and from the Kli, he's Zorik on the Mizbeach. In the case of Chatos, he's got to put his Etzba into the Dam, and then apply it to the Mizbeach. Ha'ika Keren, that's what we said before, that you need Kronos, and Ha'ika Chuda, also, the Mizbeach has edges on all 4 sides, and the Dam of Chatos has to be placed on Chuda, on the edge of the altar, and then it drips down the side of the Mizbeach. And the Gemara says, Alachad mitrei tlas taimi nokat. He could have had 3 different arguments, but he chose one. And he mentioned only that one, that in Chatos, the Zrika is on the top half of the Mizbeach. Omar Mar, Omar lo Rabbi Shalom Marta. Rabbi Yeshua says that the Chumrah of Chatos is that the Zrika is above the middle line, the red line of the Sikra of the Mizbeach, and therefore you can't derive any conclusions from Chatos to Osham regarding Shalol Lishma Apostle, Lemole Rabbi Eliezer, Osham Nami Domo Lamala. Since Rabbi Eliezer has an equation between Osham and Chatos, then to the same extent that Chatos requires a Zrika Lamala, so too, by process of equation, an Osham should require Zrika Lamala B'Mizbeach. So therefore, why didn't Rabbi Eliezer just immediately respond to Rabbi Yeshua by saying that Osham also requires Lamala? Abai Osham Domo Lamala Lomotzis Amen. Abai says that Rabbi Eliezer is forced by virtue of a Kal V'chomer, as we'll soon see, to admit that Osham does not require Zrika Lamala. And what's this Kal V'chomer? Mi Ola. Ma Ola shehi kolil. Ola is more chomer than Osham because Osham, the Kohanim eat part of the basar. In the case of Ola, it's completely burnt on the Mizbeach. And Damalamata, and yet the carbon Ola, the Zrika is done, the blood is sprinkled on the bottom half of the Mizbeach. Osham sheina kolil kolshkin. Osham, which doesn't have the chumrah of kolil. As we said before, the basar is eaten by the Kohanim, is how much more so. You don't require that chumrah of lamala. So Gemara says, what are you talking about? Mala ola shekain eina mechaperes. Maybe the reason why a carbon ola does not require zrika lamala is because the ola is not for the purpose of kapara. Although we did learn at one point that ola is mechaper for bittul asay, but that's not really the essence of the carbon ola. The ola is like a gift to Hashem. So therefore, maybe the reason why a carbon would require zrika lamala on the top half of the mizbeach is because it is a mechaper, and the purpose of a carbon asham is to be mechaper, because he should have been more careful and he mistakenly may have eaten chelev, and that's why Rabbi Eliezer would come to the conclusion that the zrika, the dam of a carbon asham, would have to be lamala, unless you could prove to me that there's another carbon which likewise is a mechaper, and yet it doesn't require lamala. And that's exactly what the Gemara says now. Chatas ha'ov tochia. So when the carbon chatas was brought with a bird, then it is a mechaper, and yet the dam is below the sikra. Gemara says, what are you talking about? Don't prove to me anything from chatas ha'ov, mala chatas ha'ov shekain ena min zeva. Chatas ha'ov is really sort of low on the totem pole because it's not an animal, it's a bird, and we're more makel in birds. So you can't prove anything from chatas ha'ov. Ola tochiach, but ola is brought for an animal, and yet but again, ola doesn't have the element of kapara, so we're going to have to introduce again a tzad shav. So again, you can't derive any conclusions from chatas ha'ov because it's not a zevach, it's not an animal. You can't derive any conclusions from ola because ola is not a mechaper, is lo roi zeh lo roi zeh tzad shav sheben shem kodesh kadoshim kodshi kodshim v'doma lamata afani avi osham shehu kodesh kadoshim v'doma lamata. So again, if you're going to slug up ola because it's not a mechaper, I'll quote to you the case of chatas ha'ov. And if you're going to say you can't derive any conclusions from chatas ha'ov because it's not a zevach, I'll quote the case of ola. The common denominator between ola and chatas ha'ov is that they're all kodesh kadoshim, and yet the zrika is done lamata, and therefore we should derive from that tzad shava that asham also is zrika lamata. Gemara doesn't like that either. There's a chumrah in asham that doesn't apply to the other karbonos, and that is that the market value of the carbon has to be at least 2 shkolim, and that is quoted by Rashi here, and it's a sugya later on in Daf Tzadi. So therefore, maybe in asham we should derive the conclusion that asham, like chatas, should require a zrikas dam lamala. And if you're going to quote ola and chatas ha'of, I'll tell you, wait a minute. Here's a chumrah in asham that doesn't apply neither to chatas ha'of nor to ola. That is that you need a minimum value of the karma. Okay, so now at this point, the Gemara has to admit that we need another source to prove that that asham and its zrika is below the sikra, lamata, and that justifies why Rabbi Eliezer did not argue against Rabbi Yeshua and say, wait a minute, the dam of the carbon asham is lamala. Elahainu taima de Rabbi Eliezer. We're going to need a special limud to prove that asham, despite the chumrah of shnei shkolim, and despite the fact that it's equated to chatas, nevertheless the zrika is lamata. Tiamar koin amachata osa. Right, osa, and machata is referring to zrika sadam. Osa is in chatos to exclude asham. Osa domo lamala ve'ein domo shel acher lamata. So no other carbon has a zrikas dam lamata, and that's derived from the miyud of osa. Ihachi, says the Gemara, chatos nami nema osa lishma kshir shelo lishma psula. Once the Torah is limiting the psul to, or the requirement in the case of zrikas adam, to chatos, then the psul of shalol lishma should be limited through this miyad of osa to chatos and not apply to asham. And now we're in trouble for Rabbi Eliezer, who says that is a psul of shalol lishma even in the case of asham. Hashar Zevachim bein lishma and bein shalol lishma ksherim. And the Gemara answers, "Hahu osa lav dafka dashir pesach." He says you can't take the word osa with regard to shalol lishma as dafka, as excluding all other karbanos, because we know that a carbon pesach which was shechted shalol lishma is possible. So the Gemara once again rejects it. Hachanami lav dafka dashir olas ha'of. Let's apply the same token to the question of zrikas hadam and whether it should be lamala lamata. And we said that Osa is going to tell me that the zrikas hadam and asham, like in all karbanos, is going to be lamata. Then you're not being consistent. Why? Because I'll show you a carbon other than chatos where you require zrikas hadam lamala to ashir olas ha'of. And this is a sugya later on Daf Samach Hey, that the dam of olas ha'of has to be applied to the top half of the mizbeach, like the chatos. And Rashi refers to that Gemara. So you're using osa, and you're saying, well, I can't use osa if there's an exception to the rule. So how do you use osa to teach me that a carbon osham, like all other karbanos, doesn't require zrika lamala like chatos, when I have a case of a carbon ola, which is not a chatos, and yet the zrika has to be lamala. That's called olas ha'of. When I came from Eretz Yisrael to learn in Rav Soloveitchik's year, he was in the middle of Chulin, and he was doing a sugya of olas ha'of about malika. I didn't know what malika was. I didn't know what an ola was. I didn't know what an oaf was. I didn't know anything. I was so lost when I got off the plane. Anyway, bizvicha mia lo shayar midi. You know, ola is subject not to shchita, but rather olas ha'of to zrika. I'm sorry, to malika. So I can't derive any conclusions from olas ha'of because that's malika, not shchita. Ibai saying, I'll give you another reason why I can't derive anything from olas ha'of, because Rabbi Elazar Reb Shimon to yomer hai makom l'chud v'hai makom l'chud. Even though an olas ha'of requires zrika, it's not exactly zrika because I think you take the oaf by hand with the dam and apply it to the mizbeach. But anyway, it's lamala min hasikra, but it's not all the way up lamala. And high makom l'chud v'hai makom l'chud. The sanya domim atachtonim nitonim michutz michud hasikra lamala. Ve'elyonim michud hasikra lamala. Omer Rabbi Elazar Reb Shimon. B'mei dvarim amur v'olas ha'of. Aval chatas behema he atzma ein nasa el al gufan shel keren. The keren is all the way on the top of the mizbeach. Whereas in the case of olas ha'of, the dam has to be placed lamala min hasikra, but not all the way on top of the mizbeach on the keren. Okay, now, after we came to the conclusion that according to Rabbi Eliezer, there's an equation between Osham and Chatos regarding Shalol Lishma, and that was the hekesh of Kechatos Osham Kechatos. Now the Gemara wants to know, should we derive another halacha from this hekesh? Tanan Hasam, we have a Mishnah on Daf Pei Aleph. Shahai Rabbi Akiva Omer called Domim Shenichnesu Leichel Lechaper Psulim. Rabbi Akiva is very machmir. Any dam of any carbon that was brought inside the heichal is possible. The carbon is possible. Hachom Omrim Chatz Bilvad. And now we have a middle of the way shita of Rabbi Eliezer. Rabbi Eliezer Af HaOsham. If the dam of the Osham is brought inside the heichal, just like in the case of dam chatos that was brought inside the heichal, apostles the carbon, so too apostles the carbon. Osham shenemar kachatos kaosham, the hekesh between chatos and osham. So we now have two halachas that we derive from that hekesh. Number one, shalol lishma is possible, and number two, that if the dam was brought in the case of an osham, like chatos inside the heichal, it's apostles the carbon. Bishleim Rabbi Eliezer kidika amar taima. I understand Rabbi Eliezer's logic because he has a hekesh between kechatos kaosham, El Rabbanan, my time, why the Rabbanan refused to accept this equation between Chatos and Osham to prove that if the dam of the Osham is brought inside the Heichal, it passes the korban. After all, the Torah does say, Kachatos ke Osham. Omar Rava, Osham nichnas domo lifnim hosul lo motzis l'meimah. The Rabbanan hold that the possibility that if the dam of the chatas is brought inside the heichal, it passes the korban lo motzim. That's not a tenable position. Why? Kal v'chomer me'ola. So we'll get a start here on Daf Yud Aleph because we're still trying to catch up from 2 days of Rosh Hashanah. Ola shehi kolil. Ola is very chamur, and it's kulo kolil. And yet, nichnas dam lifnim kshera. Even if you brought the dam inside the heichal, in the case of an ola, the korban ola is still kosher. Asha menu kolil. Asha is relatively what's the opposite of stringent? Light, because there's no din of kolil. It doesn't get all burnt up. It's eaten partially by the kohanim. So kolshkin, how much more so that the dam, if it's brought inside the heichal, would not passel. Because if ola doesn't passel, then certainly the chumrah of psul of dam bifnim v'hecha wouldn't apply to asham, which is lakula. So the Gemara says, what are you talking about? Mala ola shekain eina mechaperes. Maybe the reason why, in the case of ola, the Torah was makil, and if the dam was brought inside the heichal, it doesn't pass the korban. That kula is based on the fact that an ola is not a mechaper. It's essentially not for the purpose of a kapara. But in the case of korban asham, which is for atonement, for kapara, that's the essence of the korban, maybe the Torah would be more machmir, and the dam of a korban asham that was brought bifnim would pass the korban. Where it says, minchas chote tochiach. I'll bring you a case where the purpose of the korban is kapara, and yet if it's brought bifnim. Now, what do you mean brought bifnim? There's no dam over here. We're talking about a minchas chote. What's a minchas chote? You're talking about a korban olav yored where he financially could not afford to bring a zevach, so we let him get away with a mincha. And that mincha is going to be mechaper for those averas for which a korban olav yored is mechaper. And the halacha is that kmitza equals zrika. And if in the case of dam of a zevach, if it was brought inside the heichal, it would passel the korban. So to kmitza, if it was done inside the heichal, would also passel the korban. And yet, the halacha is that even though a korban minchas chote is a kapara, and yet if it's brought inside the heichal, meaning the kmitza was brought inside the heichal, he calls it the kometz. Okay, we call it the kmitza, which corresponds to the dam of a korban zevach. If it's brought into the heichal, the korban mincha is still kosher. So you see clearly that the fact that it is a mechaper is not going to justify that bringing it into the heichal would be possible, because here we have a case where it's a mechaper, and yet you bring it into the heichal and it's still kosher. V'lema chatas ha'ov tochia. What about chatas ha'ov? You didn't have to slug up this logic here by quoting minchas chote. What about chatas ha'ov? And in the case of chatas ha'ov, the halacha is that even though it's brought for the sake of kapara, nevertheless, if the dam of the chatas ha'of was brought inside, then, right, again, chatas ha'of is also in the case of korban oval yored. He's not totally dal shevedalos, he's not totally poor. And yet, in the case of chatas ha'of, if the blood was brought inside the heichal, as we said before, it doesn't passel the korban. So you see that, the fact that it is a mechaper, which certainly chatas ha'of is a mechaper, yet the dam doesn't have to be sprinkled on top of the mizbeach. So Gemara says, Chatos ha'of bayad Rabbi Oven. Rabbi Oven actually vacillated back and forth about the status of the dam of a Chatos ha'of that was brought inside the Heichel, whether it passes the korban or not. So we wanted to avoid, getting into the suffix of Rav Oven. And now we're going to go back to a discussion about Minchas Chote. And we said that Minchas Chote does bring a kapara. And we said that the fact that it is a mechaper is not going to in any way generate the halacha that the dam, if it's brought inside the heichel, should passel, because in a minchas chote, despite the fact that it's a mechaper, it doesn't become possible if the dam of the mincha, again, when I say dam, I mean the kvitza of a minchas chote was brought inside the heichel. V'lifroch mal minchas chote shekain eno min zeva. Well, why didn't the Gemara just completely reject minchas chote? Minchas chote can't prove anything one way or the other because it's not an offering of a zeva. And the Gemara answers, Ola tochiach. Then we're going to show from Ola that there's no din of a psul korban if the dam was brought biftim. But again, you can't prove anything from Ola because Ola is not a kapara. It's not a korban for a kapara. And then we're going to quote Minchas Chote, where again, if you bring the kvitza inside, it doesn't pass the mincha. And even though Minchas Chote is for the purpose of a kapara, then you're going to slug up Minchas Chote because Minchas Chote is not a zeva. It's a chosar adin, lo roi zeh karoi zeh, lo roi zeh karoi zeh. We're going to have a tzad shovash ben shekein kodshei kodshim. And yet nichnas dom bifnim ksherim. Afani ovi osham, shu kodesh kadoshim, nichnas dom bifnim kosher. All right, we'll do one more line and then we'll end. You cannot derive any conclusions from a combination of both Ola and Chatos Minchas Chote. Why not? Asham, as we said before, has to be purchased with a minimum of 2 shkolim. That's a unique chumrah of carbon asham. It doesn't apply neither to chatos, neither to ola nor to minchas chote. And therefore, maybe in the case of asham, the Torah would be machmir, and if you bring the dam inside the heichel, it would pass the carbon. And therefore, we need now another source to prove, according to the Rabbanon, that an asham does not become possible if you bring the dam into the heichal, and that's going to be the Ella that Belinetta will study tomorrow. Okay, then, so have a meaningful fast, and hopefully we can get together tomorrow. Let me know if there's any problem in terms of the regular time, 9:30.